Did Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, really marry a 6-year-old child? Assalamu alaikum. I'm Munib Ali. Welcome to another video on the Qur'an study channel. Now, as you know, we've been studying the truth about whether Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, could have married a 6-year-old child. Now, we have already done 2 study sessions into this. So we've done parts 1 and 2, and today we're doing part 3. Now, parts 1 and 2 were specifically focused on what the Qur'an tells us about the age of marriage, and also what the Qur'an tells us about what Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, would have done in this regard. If you haven't had a chance to have a look at those videos, it's really important that you do so. So please do go over to our YouTube channel and have a look at parts 1 and 2. Now, part 3, as I promised, is going to be a study into the hadith that people believe in, which suggests that Prophet Muhammad did marry Hazrat AISHA when she was 6 years old, a 6-year-old child. This is that hadith. This is the one that we are going to be studying today, inshallah. We're going to be looking at whether really this could be true. Now, before we do today's study session, let me just say something. You will probably have noticed that this is the first time that we are actually undertaking a study of a hadith, when normally our study sessions are focused purely on the Qur'an. And indeed that is the case. This channel is about studying the Qur'an. The reason that I've made an exception for today to look at this hadith is that this particular one is used by many people to slander the Prophet, to slander Islam, and thereby to slander God. And because our channel is about bringing to you the truth from the Qur'an, it is important to study these types of hadiths, which are used as weapons by people to attack Islam. And we need to be able to respond to that. And the other reason is that even Muslims, people who claim to be Muslims, they believe in this hadith over and above what we have studied in the Qur'an. Now, you might find that as quite shocking. I do too, but it is the reality. A lot of people have responded to my previous videos where it is clear what the Qur'an says about the age of marriage, and they have still defended this hadith. Isn't it ironic that many Muslims are prepared to take other people's lives when they think that the other person is disrespecting Prophet Muhammad? People have died because they've drawn a cartoon of Prophet Muhammad or said something negative about him. Yet even Muslims, they are prepared to believe these types of hadiths which do nothing but cause disrepute to the Prophet and to Islam. And that's why we need to be studying this. That's why I've made an exception. So I hope this is going to be useful for you. And please don't forget, if you do find this useful, please just click on the like button you see below, because that really helps to spread the message on YouTube. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at in respect of this hadith is whether this hadith is reliable. Now, when we're looking at whether a hadith is reliable, the first thing to note in this regard is that we've already studied from the Qur'an that this could not be true. We've already studied from the Qur'an what the age of marriage is. And so from that itself, we can conclude that this hadith is not reliable. But I know you don't want me to end it there, so we're going to look further into this hadith. What we're going to do is look at history. So, there are lots of historians who have spent a lot of their time, dedicated a lot of their time to try and understand what was happening at the time that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was alive, including the history of his wives. Okay, so we must look at what that history tells us, and we must use our logic as well. Now, there are lots of historians, and there are two particular points of reference which I was looking at to try and understand this deep history. And I managed to get 2 books off my father, who has a fantastic library around these sorts of matters. And both of these books which I've looked at are in Urdu. Thankfully, I'm able to read and understand Urdu as well. One of these books is called Riwayat-e-Ifk, which broadly means the tradition of allegations. And the other one is An-Nikah min Sunnati. I will put the references in the description to this video as well. These are actually quite rare books. They're very hard to come by. But my father managed to source them. And I've used some other references as well as part of my research, which again I'll put into the description. And do feel free to have a look at them and cross-reference what I'm suggesting today. So, the history. Now, the first thing to understand when it comes to this history, and this is really important, at the time of Prophet Muhammad, there was no system of registering births. There is no birth certificate that can say and tell us beyond doubt the date that Hazrat Aisha was born. So if you had a birth certificate and you had a marriage certificate, you'd be able to work out beyond doubt what the age was. But we don't have that. There are no artifacts which give us with absolute certainty what the age was. Now, that's important because by itself, that tells us that we cannot accept any historical reference to the age of Hazrat Aisha at the time she got married to the Prophet. We cannot take such references beyond doubt. There is always doubt. There is always a level of uncertainty because there are no recovered artifacts that tell us what age she was. Alright? So, let's have a look at the next point. Now, this is a point of history as well. One thing that we should know is that before Hazrat Aisha got engaged to Prophet Muhammad, she was in fact engaged to somebody else first. She was engaged to Jubair bin Mut'im bin Adi, and history tells us that he was part of a very well-off family. He was very rich. And if you look at the history of Jubair bin Mut'im bin Adi, there appears to be no reference or no reason to suggest that he would marry a little child. And remember, she would have been even younger than 6 years old when she was engaged to this individual. And there's nothing in history that suggests that he would have married a little child playing with dolls. Now, this is also very important here. So, let's think about intellectual maturity. I would want us to bear in mind and remember that she was allegedly 6 years old when she got married to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the year 2 after Hijri. So 2 years after Prophet Muhammad migrated to Medina. History also tells us that Hazrat Aisha accepted Islam in the year 1 after Hijri. So there are historical references to suggest that. This would mean that she would be 5 years old when she accepted Islam. Now let's think about this. A 5-year-old child. How can a 5-year-old child who was playing with dolls, and there are hadiths which suggest that she was playing with dolls even after she got married to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, how can a 5-year-old child have the intellectual capacity to not just understand, listen and understand, and then claim that she has converted to Islam? A 5-year-old child. Can that make sense to you? Logic would tell us that when she accepted Islam, she would have been a grown woman with the intellectual maturity and capacity to understand Islam, understand the revelations of God, and then decide that this was the truth, and then claim to have accepted it. Now, the other thing about this is that if you look through the hadiths, there are many, many narrations which start from Hazrat Aisha. Many detailed recollections around the time that the migration to Medina allegedly took place. All sorts of recollections from her about the decrees that came from God around inheritance, about the wars and battles that took place, so on and so forth. Could a young child recollect such detail? Such minute detail which you find in the written book hadiths? Logic would tell us that she would have been a grown woman when she was recollecting such matters, not a child. But let's continue. Now let's think about the situation that Prophet Muhammad was in before he got married to Hazrat Aisha. Only recently before that, his wife, Hazrat Khadija, had passed away. So what Prophet Muhammad needed at the time, with the family and the household and the commitments he had, he needed someone who could support him through such difficult times. In that moment, in that situation, can you imagine that he would have married a 6-year-old child that he would have to look after? A child that's playing with dolls. This just does not fit any form of logic. And bear in mind, history tells us that Prophet Muhammad's youngest daughter at that time that he got married was at least 13 years old. So imagine he has 2 daughters at home at the time. 2 were married, so they had moved out. He had 2 daughters at home. The youngest one was at least 13 years old. And then he marries a 6-year-old child? Why would he do that? There is no logical explanation for this. That should create doubt in the authenticity of this narrated hadith. Now let's think about the actual person who narrated this. The person who said that Hazrat Aisha was 6 years old when she was married to Prophet Muhammad. The narrator was Hisham bin Urwah. Now about him, the first thing to say is that many people who people deem to be scholars, like Ibn Kathir, have said that he was untrustworthy. They have documented on paper that his narrations should not be trusted. Well, this was one of his narrations. Also bear in mind that there were no transmissions of said hadith before the year 145 after Hijri, after the migration. At that point in time, Hisham was 84 years old. History tells us that he had dementia and he was not able to articulate things clearly. History also tells us that this particular hadith that he narrated was transmitted to people in Iraq. Right, so there was a group of people in Iraq who he transmitted this to, but there was no validation undertaken of this narration. So again, if anything, this should create doubt in the authenticity of this hadith. Marry that up with the conviction with which people quote that this happened. It just doesn't make sense. Oh, and by the way, before we continue, if you are finding this useful, please just click on like to help our video get seen by more people on YouTube. Okay, let's talk mathematics. So there's an issue here with the arithmetic. So there are many historians that have said, according to their research, that there was a 5-year gap between the marriage being agreed between Prophet Muhammad and Hazrat Aisha, and then her moving in with him. A 5-year gap. Well, this hadith, if you remember, said that the marriage was agreed when she was 6 years old, and it was consummated when she was 9. 6 plus 5 does not equal 9, or does it? And the second piece of mathematics, which is very interesting, is about Hazrat Aisha's elder sister, Hazrat Asma. So history tells us that she died in the year 73 after Hijri, and she was 100 years old at the time. History also tells us that she was 10 years older than Hazrat Aisha. Okay? Now, if we undertake some very simple arithmetic on this one, it tells us at the time of migration, Hazrat Asma would have been 27 years old. 100 minus 73. So she was 27 years old. So if she was 10 years older than Hazrat Aisha would have been 17 years old at the time of the migration. And she was married and she moved in with Prophet Muhammad around that time. Nowhere close to being either 6 years old or 9 years old. Can you see how this is not making sense? This hadith is not making sense. And I should say that there are many other contradictions contained within the hadith and other historical texts relating to the age of Hazrat Aisha. I'm only putting forward in today's study session a few of these. There are even more mathematical inconsistencies if we look through the history of Hazrat Aisha and the years of the migration. So let's go back to our original question. Based on everything we've looked at and we've studied today, all of which is based on historical research done by respected historians, can this hadith be reliable? And the answer's got to be no. It cannot be. Now, I want to make a really, really important point about what we've learnt today. Outside of this particular matter, I want to make a very important point for us to take forward. But before we do that, remember why we were doing this study. So we've been undertaking this study as part of a group of study sessions we've been undertaking, which is looking at what the Qur'an says about women and the rights of women, because this is where Muslims and others have so many misconceptions. So this particular session, these 3 parts we've now done, we're looking to answer this question about, can a man marry a 6-year-old girl? And the answer is no. And we've completed this session. And there are a number of other different sessions we're about to do, inshallah, which are looking at women's rights, as I've put over here on this slide. Okay, so now let's think about the lessons we've learned. The first thing is that if we want to know the truth about any matter, brothers and sisters, we must turn to the Qur'an. The Qur'an is Al-Furqan. If we say we believe in the Qur'an, if we believe that the Qur'an is Al-Furqan, the criterion for the truth and falsehood, the criterion for justice and injustice, the criterion for right and wrong, the criterion for good deeds and bad deeds. If we truly believe this, as we claim to believe, then we will turn to the Qur'an to assess the truth about any matter. And we've used today's study about the age of Hazrat Aisha as an example. The point here is that man-made written history is not 100% reliable. Unless we have uncovered artifacts which prove a point, written history, it doesn't matter whether it's hadith, it doesn't matter whether it's any other point of historical reference or research, it cannot be 100% reliable. And that's why you have so many different points of views about history. Once we understand that, we'll be able to think about how we find the truth. And that truth is in the Qur'an. We must use this lesson of what we've picked up today to understand and think about the success that the enemies of Islam have had. They have got us, and I use us as the community of so-called Muslims, they have got us to blindly accept such hadith and thereby abandon the Qur'an. There are people who would rather accept this hadith that we looked at today and say, no, that is the truth, and that you are misunderstanding the Qur'an. They will disregard the Qur'an. This is the success of the enemies of Islam. And they have managed to get us to believe things which are irrational and illogical. Believe in things which are superstitious rather than scientific. They've got us to believe in things which are false rather than true. And this has come down to us through our forefathers. Brothers and sisters, what we have to do, what we have a responsibility to do, is to spread the truth. The falsehood about Prophet Muhammad, about Islam, has been propagated for far too long. It's time we turn back to the Qur'an, the pristine message of God that was delivered to us by Prophet Muhammad. We must turn back to it to know the truth and to inform people of the truth. I've come across people who have left the fold of Islam, who have started to disbelieve in there being a God because of the hadith that we discussed today. They say that Prophet Muhammad could not have been a good man. He was a mean, irrational, child-abusing person. How could he have been a prophet? How could God have chosen such a prophet? And by the way, this allegation is against the prophet, which is false. This is not even the worst of it. There are far worse allegations against the prophet. And people believe them. People believe such falsehood. And we've abandoned the Qur'an, the truth, the word of our Creator. I hope this study has given us all something to think about what we need to do and where we need to turn to find the truth for our own salvation. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.
أفلا يتدبرون القرآن